Hi, in this video we're going to go through a tutorial to create a button grid with single updated buttons using Ajax and JavaScript. So you can see here this on the screen here the application that we're going to make. So if I click on a button such as this one here, you can see it changes color, but the timestamp on the screen indicates that the page is not refreshing, so it's only refreshing one piece of the button. You can also see over in the console that every time I click a button, there is a new piece of data that's being logged, and this is the contents of each button. So you can see the value here was 9.2, which was this guy right here. So 9.3 is the new value. So we are going to modify an existing application and change it into an Ajax enabled interface. So if you haven't done the button grid tutorial, and to get to this point, you need to go back and check that out. So we're going to use C#, ASP.NET, CSS, JavaScript, jQuery, all those technologies here to make this happen. So let's get started where we were at the last video. Okay, so I have just regressed the state of the application back to where it was at the last tutorial. So you can see that I have a console open and the buttons, and there are no messages in the log. So if I click a button, it will update the button, but it takes an entire page refresh. You can see that in the tops of the up in the URL that the action changes each time. And so it doesn't look too bad in response, but occasionally it takes an entire half a second or so to reload the page. So we're trying to go from this point to the Ajax enabled and partial page updates. So let's start from this section here where we were at the last video. The first change that I'm going to make is in the layout. So let's go into Views, Shared, and Layout. And I want to add a new link so that the nav bar includes a part where I can just click and I don't have to type in a URL for me. So let's change the controller to button and the action to index, and then we'll give the title here something like button grid. Okay, so that'll make things easier when I'm trying to test the program. Now I'm going into the views again, and for index I'm going to change a few things here. So I want to have a div that surrounds the button. So the reason why I want to put a div around the button is so I can control it with a partial page update. So let's put a div before and after the button section. We'll give it a class name of, let's say, one button, and each one will have an ID of the counter I. So I comes from the for loop iterator, and so each button will have a unique number. That will help us when we do the jQuery and the JavaScript programming in the click listeners. Now let's start programming in the JavaScript. So I open up the folder in www.root, JS, and site. In here, I'm going to first of all make sure that the page is loaded. So we'll call a function in a $ parentheses area, and that function will just say console log page is ready. And while we're here, let's add a click listener to each of the button events. So the class name for a button was called .game-button. And then we will add a prevent default action to it, so that way we will override whatever submit button was there, and we will let the JavaScript take care of it. So for right now, we're just going to log out a message that says game button was clicked. Let's test this out and see what it looks like. Alright, the application's up and running. You can see I have a new link in my nav bar to button grid, so I don't have to type that in anymore. I'm going to check the console, so we'll inspect the area, switch to the console, and we can see the first message that says page is ready. So now if I click somebody, you can see that I have a message that says game button was clicked. However, nothing happens on the screen. We haven't done anything, but at least we don't have to refresh the entire page now. This looks like the JavaScript is ready to take over. So I don't have to close the browser and stop the program and recompile, because for a little while here all we're going to code is JavaScript. So I'm going to leave this running and switch back into the JavaScript code. So now I'm going to change the statement a little bit. I'm going to capture the value of the button number that was clicked. So I'm going to use the statement this. So $this refers to whatever was clicked. So this is the button. And it has a value, which we'll check in just a second. Now I'm going to log out the button number as well. So we'll just make a little bit of adjustment to the string that's being logged and say button number was clicked. Now let's go check to see where this value came from. So this part here is apparently going to show me a value. How did I know that? Let's switch back into index and check out what was already defined. So on line 46 in my app, you can see that up till this point here, we have a button with a class of game button. And then we have the value, which is the model's element ID item. So the ID number of the button is contained in its value. And so that is why when we're in the JavaScript, we can say this button, get its value, assign it to the variable called button number. Now I've got the application running, so I'm going to switch back to Chrome, refresh the page, and let's see what happens now when I click. So I click the button in the corner. It says button 4 was clicked. The first one was button 0. The last one is button 24. So you can see that I printed the button number at the bottom of each button. So this should be 8. And sure enough, it says 8 when I click it here. So test this out to make sure that all the buttons have the proper number associated with them. Looks to me like it's working, so I'm going back to the programming. So now in the controller, I'm going to add a new action event called show one button. And its job will be to display exactly one button. So I'm going to have the button number so I know which button I'm trying to update. Then I'm going to return a partial view instead of a full view. And so its job will be to display only one piece of the board, just the button part. So we'll have to program that in a second. Now I also have to update the value of this button. So since it's been clicked, let's upgrade and increment its status. So inside of the application action, we need to change the status of the button. So the goal is to upgrade it by 1 increment. And if it gets greater than 4, then we'll reset it to 0. So let's do the status here. Let's go buttons, element at button number, and check the status, or the state, I guess it's called. And we'll add 1 to it. Now we don't want to just add 1, we want to do the mod 4, so that way if it gets to 5, it will reset to 0. So mod 4 keeps us in bounds. Now we've got ourselves the whole item, but we don't have a view yet. So we need to create a view to match this action. So show one button will generate an error right now. So I'm going to right click and choose add view, so that way we can have a show one button view. So let's go to the razor view that has the models associated with it. We're going to associate it with the details, and then we're going to choose the model to be button model. Make sure that the rest of these are checked as shown and choose add. So the new view has been created. Now I'm really only interested in the first line of this entire project because I want to make sure that I have the right model. Now the rest of it here will print a small table, and that's really not what I'm interested in. I want to have it formatted like we did in the game, where there's a circle and then a small pair of numbers beneath it. So I can delete all of the code except for line 1, and I'll get my result. So the code that I want to put in here has actually already been done for us. I'm going to index to get that. So the code is this section right here. I want to have one button, and so I'll copy this and bring it back into the show one button area. So this here will be displaying one button. Now there's a problem here. We have the image names that is not defined. So I had that also defined in the index area. So let's go to this section at the top here where it's got the array created. We'll copy that and switch back into show one button and put that at the top line. So make sure that you got all of these details set up here. So this doesn't quite work either. You can see here that we're still assuming that the model is a list of things, and so it says I don't know what I is. That came from a for loop. So really, model is no longer a list, it is a single item. So I can just take out the whole reference to element at and leave it as model.id or model.buttonState. And the same thing down here. We have model ID and model.buttonState, and we should have the better results and all errors go away. So I'm going to save that, and it looks like it's ready to go. Now we need to go and change this in our code so that it displays properly. So when I say code, I meant JavaScript code. So let's switch to the site area, and we're going to make some modifications here. So let's now go and do an Ajax request to see if we can get one button and the data that goes with it. So in the game button click function, let's add a reference to another function called do button update, and we'll provide it the button number. So inside of do button update, we're going to do the Ajax work. So $Ajax, of course, is the Ajax command in jQuery. Then we need to provide some details in a JSON object. So we use these curly brackets. The first thing is what kind of data are we expecting? Now I'm going to send a JSON object. So I will put data type as JSON, and we'll define the data in just a minute. The second is the method. We're going to do a post method, so that way the controller can handle a post. Then the URL tells us which action we want to send the data to, and we've just defined that as show one button. So now we're going to use that. So now the data. I'm going to send it as a JSON object because that's what I told it to do up on the data type line. So I want to create a new object, and I'm going to define it as button number as the identifier, and then the value will be the number itself, which was also called button number. That was passed in as the parameter. And then finally, the success function. So what happens when the controller sends back some data? Well, for right now, I'm just going to console log it so we can see what kind of data format it is. So this will give us something to test out. It will not update the display yet, but we'll get to see what to do next. So let's run the application and see what results are coming. Okay, so we got the application running. Let's go ahead and click the link for button grids and inspect so we can see the console. So we'll get the console open, and we have a message that should say page is ready. Now let's click the first guy, and we have ourselves 0 was clicked, and then the response shows a bunch of HTML code. And it looks to me like that is the same code that we would expect to be displayed. So the change of value looks like it's happening. So if you notice here, this green button was clicked, and its value was 1, 1, as you can see. And the new value is now coming back as 1, 2. And so if we were to update the display, this should show then what color? 2, it looks like it's a purple. So this should turn purple. This seems to be almost there. We've got the code coming back from our controller that is showing a little snippet of HTML code. We should be able to substitute that into the proper point on the page now. So we have to add some more JavaScript to do that. So to make that happen, we'll switch back into the JavaScript, and after we log the data, let's substitute one of the regions of the page. Now I created a button, each div has its own ID number that matches the button number. So we can just put in a # plus, or concatenate I should say, the button number. And then we'll change the HTML content to equal the data that was sent back, because that data is the HTML for that section. So this should now update the display. Let's see if it works. So I switch back into the browser, refresh, and let's check to make sure the log is ready. It says page is ready, and now I click the first item. And sure enough, we get the results here. It says 03 in the console, and 03 showed up on the screen. So all of these seem to work. Now we've got a problem, is that if I were to click a button again, it doesn't appear any different, but you can see that the URL changed. So it is no longer running JavaScript. It started working in the controller. So strange behavior. The first time you click a button that has not been displayed yet, it should work properly. And then the second time, it has to refresh the page. You'll see a delay. So that's an odd behavior that we'll fix. So just to make sure that I'm correct on that odd behavior, I'm going to go back into the index page and put in a statement that says the current time. So just before the form, we'll say current time, and we'll do datetime.now. So that way we can see if the page is truly reloading or not. Let's run it again. Okay, the app is up and running, so let's go to the button grid area, and let's check the inspect and console. That's all the things that we did before. Okay, so here it goes. We have the time now displayed. It was 10:47 and 42 seconds. I click the first item, and it still remains at 42 seconds. If I click any other item, it seems to work. So I've clicked the first 4 or 5 buttons on the first line. Now I'm going to go back and click any one of those again, and you can see the page refreshed, and I have a new time up here. So the first time that I experienced this just totally baffled me. It's like I have a click listener on these buttons, and the JavaScript was totally ignored. So why is that? Let me show you what's going on here. So let's show side by side the JavaScript code and the buttons. So you think of what happens when you click a button here. So let's say button 1 or 0, I guess it is, the first button. So when I click him, the click listener here on line 8 responds. It says it has a class of .gameButton, so I will respond to the click. However, you think of what happens then after I click it. Later on in the code, it says here on line 28, we're going to replace the entire contents of that section with new code. So at the beginning, when the page was first loaded, the browser recognized that this thing here is part of the collection of items that have a class of GameButton. However, when you replace it dynamically with some code like we did here, the click listener is removed and the new code comes in and the click listener is no longer associated with it. And so we lose the ability to do a second click on a button, and it reverts then to handling a full page refresh. So the page refresh is obviously what we're trying to avoid. So to make that happen, we have to avoid using this format here of game button click. It's just one slight change, and then you'll see why it works in just a minute. So the code that I have to change here is on line 8. So I'm going to modify this root. So instead of saying look for anything with the game button class, I'm going to say look for anything that's in the document. So the document is the entire page. And so in the document, we have another way to have events associated with it. So the event is called on. And on can be any kind of event. And we're going to use click again. So on click, we could do on change, we could do on other things probably too. And then after the word click, we're going to say which types of classes we'll be listening for. And so anywhere in the document where there is a game button, we will associate this function. So the document itself won't change. We're just changing the pieces on the document. So this click listener should remain in effect even though we're replacing pieces on the page. Let's see if this works. So I'm going to save this and then refresh the browser so we can reload the JavaScript. So now we've got ourselves, form is ready. We click a guy, we get the update, we click it again, and it behaves like we expect it to. So you notice the timestamp is not changing even though we're clicking a button twice. And so this was perhaps very confusing to me, at least when the first time I came across this. I was frustrated about why my JavaScript wasn't working. And then a couple of things on, of course, Stack Overflow would explain it to me. Or had I read the manual, maybe I would have understood what I was supposed to do. So here you go. This is a common problem that you'll find. If you're replacing pieces on the page, you will lose the original click listener for buttons that have been replaced dynamically. So now we're more up to date. So now we have another problem though. I'm going to change all of the buttons on the screen to a single color. And remember, the goal here is to get all of the buttons to match. So when I get to the end here and I click the last button and it turns blue, the message at the bottom of the screen remains as it was before. So it says, not all buttons are the same color. Can you make them match? And it appears to me that they have all matched. So why doesn't that code work anymore? Well, the answer is that we did that check, hopefully, in the click listeners or the processing in the controller. So now the controller doesn't have that update one button. We're using all the changes in JavaScript. So what I want you to do then is to use your JavaScript code to check for a winning condition. And if it wins, then of course you want to tell the user. So make some modifications. I'm going to leave that as a challenge because you've probably already got the code already designed. You just need to move it into a new place. So what have you learned here in this video? Well, we've learned to do another Ajax update just like we did in the previous tutorial. We've also learned that we have this event listener that has to be changed from click to on click and then the class name. We've had a partial view update, so we created something in our controller to do partial views. In the next video, we're going to take a products program that we made earlier that showed an entire index of things that you could buy, and we're going to do partial page updates there because, as I recall, we had like 1,000 items on one page and the page reload was very sluggish. So this same strategy will be very helpful in a large page where lots of data is being shown. So we'll see you in the next video.